If you're a researcher, or maybe you sit on an ethics committee, you already know just how complex the ethical landscape of internet research has become. So today, we're going to unpack the essential framework for getting it right, the AoIR 3.0 guidelines. Let's dive in.
Now, just to be crystal clear, everything we're going to talk about comes directly from this foundational document, the Association of Internet Researchers Ethical Guidelines 3.0. And our goal here isn't just to summarize it. We're really focused on how to apply it in the real world, in your work.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll get a handle on what AoIR 3.0 actually is. Then, we'll dig into its core ethical framework. From there, we'll tackle some of the key problem areas that researchers are wrestling with right now. And finally, we'll see how all of this plays out in applied research.
So what is AoIR 3.0? Well, the most important thing to get right off the bat is that this is not some brand new rulebook. Think of it as an evolution of the existing guidelines, one that's been very thoughtfully updated to address the world we're in now, a world of big data, AI, massive platform power, and unfortunately, very real risks to researchers themselves.
To really appreciate what this version does, it helps to see the progression. The earlier versions 1.0 and 2.0, they laid the essential groundwork for that first era of social media. AoIR 3.0 builds on that absolutely, but its focus is squarely on the challenges of today. Things like big data, machine learning, and a much, much deeper focus on keeping researchers safe.
All right, let's get into the philosophical heart of these guidelines. And this part is absolutely crucial. AoIR 3.0 is designed to move us away from a simple check-the-box compliance mentality. Instead, it really champions ethics as an ongoing, reflective process.
This quote from the document just says it all, doesn't it? Guidelines, not recipes. The world of internet research is just way too complex and fast-moving for a rigid set of recipes. The goal here is not to follow a formula, but to develop sound, defensible ethical judgment, especially when things get ambiguous.
And that leads to this really powerful idea. Ethics isn't just some hurdle you have to clear at the beginning of your project. It's actually woven into the very fabric of your methodological choices. When you think ethically about your design, your data, your analysis, you're not just avoiding problems, you're actually conducting better, more rigorous research, period.
The guidelines are also built on this really important principle of ethical pluralism. What's that? Well, it's just the recognition that there isn't always one single right answer. Different ethical frameworks, different cultural norms, they can lead to different but still totally valid conclusions. And this is especially key for global internet research, where a one-size-fits-all approach just completely falls apart.
So, if ethics is a process, where does it fit? The short answer is everywhere. It starts the moment you begin your research design. It continues right through how you process and analyze your data. It's obviously critical when you disseminate your findings, and it even matters at the very end when you close out the project. It's a continuous thread, not a one-and-done task.
Okay, so let's shift from that core framework to the practical challenges on the ground. AoIR 3.0 isn't about giving us easy answers. It's about helping us ask the right questions, especially in these notoriously tricky areas.
Here's a classic one. How on earth do you get informed consent from millions of users in some massive data set? The guidelines are realistic. They acknowledge this is often just impossible. So one approach they point to is something called staged consent, where maybe you seek specific consent only much later, at the dissemination phase, for the few individuals you might want to quote directly.
And here's another really thorny issue. A user might feel that their posts in a so-called private group are completely confidential, even when, technically, they aren't. AoIR 3.0 urges us to move past that simple public-private binary and instead consider contextual integrity, which means we focus on the user's reasonable expectation of privacy within that specific context.
We also have to talk about power. As researchers, we're often really dependent on these huge corporate platforms for our data. But what happens when a platform suddenly changes its terms of service or shuts down an API? It can completely gut a research project. The guidelines push us to look critically at these power dynamics and what they mean for our research autonomy.
And this is a hugely important addition in version 3.0, protecting the researcher. When you study sensitive online groups or controversial topics, you can become a target yourself. The guidelines stress that there's a serious ethical obligation for both individuals and their institutions to plan for and mitigate these risks, everything from doxing to severe psychological harm.
Finally, with the explosion of AI and machine learning, we've got a whole new set of ethical puzzles. Our models are only as good as the data we train them on, right? So if the data is biased, the results will be biased. That's why the guidelines put so much emphasis on dataset accountability.
That's the need to be upfront and transparent about the limitations and potential biases baked right into our methods.
Okay, so let's bring all this together now. Let's see how this framework actually helps us analyze specific real-world research situations. Let's move from theory to practice.
This table gives us a really useful, practical snapshot. So for social media data, the core challenge is that public versus private expectation. So our approach is contextual integrity. When we're using platform APIs, the challenge is that power imbalance, so our approach has to be about consciously negotiating access and power. With AI models, the big one is bias, which we tackle with dataset accountability. And for visual data like memes, the potential for harm is just so much higher, which means we have to apply a much greater level of care. You can really see how the framework becomes a concrete tool for analysis.
So, as we wrap up, what's the ultimate point here? Well, the goal of this entire framework is not to create more bureaucratic rules for us to comply with. It's to empower us as researchers to cultivate and strengthen our capacity for sound, defensible, and reflective ethical judgment.
And this final quote from the document really nails it. The goal is the catalyzation of our capacities for reflective ethical judgment. It's about developing a kind of practical wisdom, the ability to navigate these complex situations thoughtfully. That, more than any single rule, is what AoIR 3.0 is really all about. And it leaves us with a question that's not just for discussion, but for each of us to take into our own work. How are you cultivating this judgment?